yesterday was really great. It was pretty much precisely what we were looking for in terms of, people really talking about their experiences doing on-the-ground work and on-the-ground work around especially struggles in higher education. So I think that's going to probably maintain for today, and it'll be awesome again. So we're starting off with our student debt panel, which Andrew will introduce in a second, but just a few updates about the conference. So we made this announcement yesterday as well, but Mark Busquet came down with the flu, so he won't be at the roundtable tonight, unfortunately. We did try to replace him last minute, but obviously it's kind of crazy given the weather and the MLA, this little thing happening on the side of the conference. So we'll still have a nice full roundtable, but he won't be a part of it. We also thankfully have lots of beer left over as well, so we can incorporate another open bar with our roundtable discussion, which I think will probably make it even livelier and better than traditional roundtables or plenary discussions. So the other thing, if you are a Twitterer, or you want to tweet a few things that you learned today, our hashtag is MLASubcon, so feel free to retweet that as we go along. Also, this afternoon during lunch, which is catered again, we thought that it would be nice to have a kind of structured conversation about what our plans for the next year might look like. We heard a lot yesterday about direct action and the way the need for consistent radical intervention, not just in moments of crises, but as an ongoing strategy for making gains in higher education. So I think one thing that we really want to take out of this conference are some concrete ideas about how to continue doing that in relationship to the MLA, but also with this kind of new autonomous collective group of individuals. So we want to have a discussion this afternoon during lunch about things that we might want to do next year at the MLA, but also ways that over the next few months we can continue our conversation and continue planning and strategizing towards the future, and gathering more people as we go as well. And then the last thing is a similar announcement, which is that the MLA announced their theme for the presidential theme for next year, which is negotiating sites of memory. So they used a good word to work with at least. So we do want to start thinking about Vancouver next year. If you have contacts there, it would be great to start thinking about who we can get in touch with. We were really fortunate this year in that lots of people who organized this had connections in Chicago, so it made things easier for homestays, for getting the space and the like. So we definitely need to start building those bridges for Vancouver and think about taking it on the road. So yeah, that can be a part of our afternoon conversation, but it's also just something to keep in mind. Will be an ongoing annual event, so we just want to grow it from here. Thank you guys for being here this morning, and I'll let Andrew take over to introduce our panel.
Okay, so today's first panel is on student debt, individuated versus collective responses. And the panel will run about an hour and a half. We have two presenters and then a set of 5 presenters, is that right? So I'll introduce each in turn. Robert Oxford is an American Studies PhD student at the University of Texas at Austin. He has worked in New York with the Occupy Student Debt Campaign and Strike Debt. His current research involves labor, class, and social economies of small towns in Texas impacted by the 21st century fracking boom. The Duke Collective will be presenting. It is a gathering of individuals who have pooled their resources for self-sufficiency, collective self-sufficiency, and they can say much more by way of introducing themselves when they take their turn. And Duke meaning, of course, Duke University in Durham. Sarah Appel will be the last presenter. She is the Dietrich School Postdoctoral Fellow in the English Department at the University of Pittsburgh. She is currently working on a book tentatively titled Touchdowns and Devil Towns, Class and the Cultural Politics of Friday Night Lights, which examines how the popular franchise of texts derived from Buzz Bissinger's 1990 sports journalism classic, films, TV series, fan blogs, and anticipated second film among them, have told and retold the story of small-town football obsession within the cultural context of ever-increasing U.S. class inequality. The first person in her family to attend college and receive a PhD, she also currently holds more than $140,000 in student loan debt. So with that, are we going with Robert first? Is that the order we're going? Okay, great.
Okay, thanks Andrew. I'm sorry I can't be there in person, but I think this is an amazing conference. I'm very happy to be part of it. Can you hear me okay? Is this working?
Yeah,
Okay. So I guess typically to spend, how much time are we sort of allotting to speakers, Andrew?
15 to 20. Just
20? Yeah, 20 minutes.
20? Okay, great. So what I thought I'd talk about is some of my experiences with organizing in New York during Occupy, and how Occupy turned into a conversation about collective debts in general, and student debt in particular. And I think we started the Occupy Student Debt Campaign as a way to channel some sort of academic response to what was going on with the activist culture in the streets, which many of us were already a part of. And part of the larger work that we did was to critique the ideology of student debt, or to try to understand what the ideology of acquiring student debt means for the 21st century college-bound student. And I think some of the themes that I wanted to talk about, I'm sure have been echoed in previous panels, which I regret missing. One is this idea that student debt itself is inevitable, that it's simply just a part of life and education, which is required, almost mandate, to have success in the 21st century knowledge economy. And for undergraduates, this is especially true, and I've interviewed many who truly believe they are not in debt. When asked how much they're in debt for, they really can't give a number, or many believe that they simply are not debtors. However, they're of course accountable for their debts, and when people are pressed about this, that they will have to repay whatever loans they have outstanding, the issue comes back to an idea of personal responsibility. So this very old school conservative notion that not only are loans inevitable and necessary, but it would be a personal failure on their part should they not be able to pay off their debts through a high-paying job, for example, after the college degree. So this is this long-term thinking that goes on, I think, in the minds of the undergraduate, and I think it's one that really needs to be addressed at the undergraduate level. And that's something we've had a very difficult time trying to do at the campus level, is to create awareness and campaign and organizing structure within campuses for undergraduates to discuss student debt. The ideology, it seems, is this cash in, cash out type of relationship with the university. So therefore, their ability to critique issues like administration bloat or increased tuition or bond issuances become obscured because it has little to no meaning in their immediate career path. And that's really, I think, I'd argue, what they consider higher education means for them is simply part of their career path only. So I think those 2 points, in terms of organizing undergraduates, may be the most useful going forward. I'd be interested to hear what others have to say about it. Is the issue of administration bloat, and sort of financial freewheeling dealing that goes on amongst the top of the administration pile at universities around the country, and its relationship to tuition increase. And while we've seen very brave resistance to tuition increase over the last couple of years, especially at UC Berkeley, but also at the City University of New York, tuition increase is also part of this student debt ideology that's an inevitable portion of the higher education experience. That a high price tag is expected, and especially if it's a so-called prestige university. And not only that, but it's sort of this inevitable issue about tuition that of course it will go up. There's little anyone or any organization can do about it. And I think Brian Whitener's focus on sinks and pools of money and debt for universities is a helpful tool to think about using with undergraduates and discussing financial issues related to the university, which may seem incredibly abstract or irrelevant to their course of study or their department. And I'm sure I'm echoing what he's already said much more interestingly than I will about sinks and pools, which is the way in which nonprofit institutions, universities are, after all, 501c3s, do not have tax for their income and their expenditures, manage their funds in such a way that they're able to accumulate money based upon the cash flow of their tuition base. So while their tuition base increases, the number of student enrollment, of course, is skyrocketing. The tuition itself is also increasing because the broader university are sort of similar to that of an empire. It must expand, and it must do so in a way that, like a shark, it must continue to expand beyond its borders, or else it sort of dies in the community, which of course is completely against the idea of university and prestige. So pooling money together for large expansion projects, whether they be these large international initiatives by like New York University, for example, setting up campuses some of the most progressive places on Earth, or more locally in terms of buying land, developing real estate for purposes beyond higher education, like retail, rely upon this idea of debt bond issuances, which I've been interested in looking at New York University. New York University runs a type of credit card scheme with its bond issuances, which now are in the billions of dollars. And I've clocked them in at almost $2 billion worth of institutional debt. They tend to issue a couple multi-million-dollar bond issuances a year. Of course, bond issuances are based upon their credit rating, and their credit rating is very much based upon assets. Assets include real estate holdings, buildings, art, all types of things which can be priced. And through these systems of sinks and pools, the empire of universities are able to turn the screw against undergraduates who more or less believe they must be there, all while excluding faculty and the interests of academic institutions in general. So what we did as part of the Occupy Student Debt campaign was to sort of come up with a few principles for this that could maybe serve as a way going forward in terms of talking about, or maybe refocusing the discussion on from student debt, which has very much gotten a lot of press, mainstream concern over the last couple of years, to that of tuition, administrative fees, expansion, the monetary kickbacks to nephews and family members, tax-free loans, that sort of thing. By talking about what's maybe most relevant and most important to the mission, what I would argue is the core principles of higher education. The first principle we thought of was that tuition should be free at public higher education institutions. There was an interesting Atlantic piece by Jordan Weissman, who recently put the tally to the idea of how much public universities would cost if they were fully subsidized by the federal government. It would be about $63 billion, which is a drop in the bucket relative to the type of money the United States government is spending for quantitative easing, for example, each quarter. So part of the issue, of course, is talking about the scale of money. When we start talking about the billions and trillions, I think for our purposes, it may be useful to talk about this at the campus level, and talking about tuitions, and talking about administrative fees, and the type of local finances and economies of higher education. Our second principle is zero interest loans for students who need them. The federal government, of course, provides loans, and part of my work has been to look at, FAFSA system and the way student loan asset-backed securities work from the point of sale, which is federal government, out into the invisible hand of the free market. And it's unfortunate that the federal government decides to take interest, compounding interest on student loans. And I think that's something that we found within the student debt campaign to be born if education is such a priority. Our third issue that really prohibits a lot of investigative research about university finances is that we believe that private colleges and universities must open their financial books. They're right now, of course, under no obligation to do so. They're private institutions. They keep it very close to the vest, and for good reason on their parts. The sinks and pools are a bit more intricate. The kickbacks are way less scrupulous, and the way private colleges and universities use endowment funds to float their credit ratings as a way of being able to bolster their ability to issue bonds and expand is reliant upon an endowment that more or less works as a hedge fund, not as a pool of money for students. And then finally, our final principle is to write off all outstanding student debt in the spirit of economic jubilee. And this is carried on over into what's going on with strike debt and the role of Jubilee, which they've had a lot of success with. Ours is maybe a little bit more utopian, but I think it's still something that we should keep in mind in terms of the goals in preserving the mission of academics in the academy in the 21st century. So I don't want to take up too much more time, but I think that's all I've had to provide for my little talk. So thank you.
Just less screen, but we'll just keep you up until everyone's done and do the Q&A.
Okay.
Does that work?
Yeah, change the, or would you be able to hear it if we change, if we put it on a different feed so that he doesn't appear up here?
Can you just minimize the window?
Oh, good point. Yes.
Okay, I just want to play.
Yeah.
Okay. And it's gonna make your face smaller.
He's already turned off his sound maybe.
Okay, so I guess we have to start with something about, because we just came out to our own attention that we've called ourselves Duke Collective, but also in some way we've been called Duke Collective by the institution probably. But there are several reasons to object to that name, not least our common disdain for Duke. But also our so-called collective is by no means restricted to Duke students. Adria is a UNC student, and also not really restricted to students. One of our friends, Mike, which is not here, is not a student at all. But we basically came together as friends in Durham that were living in proximity, and we're facing similar economic situations, conditions. So with that, and the other note that probably we should add is that the panel is on student debt, and we're not going to talk about debt, primarily because a lot of us didn't have the ability to inherit it. So because of our status as non-resident aliens, we couldn't, and our lack of credit, we had to actually do something else than inherit. So with that, I'll pass it to you.
And this is Naveed. I'm Adria. This is Celine. And this is Kareem.
And Clarissa is sick, I guess.
So I'm going to read from the paper, and then we'll kind of jump in along the way. Our project of wage sharing began in response to a pattern of atomization, competition, depression, and anxiety in graduate student life that was largely driven by our department's increasingly aggressive adoption of market-oriented paradigms for professionalism. In hindsight, we can say that we aim to combat the effects of commodified life in our academic experience by creating an alternative practice of economic distribution. That is, we've come to the conclusion that by tying our studies, which are individuated by practices of authorship and ownership, to our wages, which are individuated by forms of unequal economic distribution, the university had created an environment where it was easy to garner and sustain that rather commonplace illusion that persists in a society of wage labor. That is, the usual perception that academia is a meritocracy, where I earn my grant because I worked for it. The belief in merit, alongside apparently shrinking funding opportunities, necessitated all kinds of professional activity in order to increase one's chances of success, such as keeping a low profile among friends as to what grants you're applying to, then divulging the success of your secret to employers in the form of a CV. A practical ethic that transforms potential friendships to collegial relationships, that is, cooperation to competition, solidarity to antagonism, friends to colleagues. So long then as my grant, stipend, and wage appeared to be my own, and my work appeared to be solely the project of my own mind, the rise of a professional ethic, with its concomitant anxiety of plagiarism, one that made impossible the formation of something like an intellectual community where friends develop ideas together, could only reinforce such standard academic practices as solitary writing and research. It is, yes.
So when we enter Duke, we have this thing called responsible conduct of research, which is we are supposed to learn about ethics in this forum. And I remember that the only problem that came up for students in humanities, because the forum is designed for like people who do experiments with animal and human subjects, plagiarism. And the anxiety was that as a student, I'm going to talk in the class and other people are going to steal my ideas. So the idea of classroom largely was a place where you were supposed to utter something, trademark, copyright, and pass on.
It is easy then to maintain the reality of our illusory individuation, since it is continuously instituted and reinforced through various economic practices, such as the individuation of wages, which tied one's means of subsistence to the individual performance of rituals of professionalization. And so just as we first came to pray, and then we began to believe, we found that first we get our pay, and then we think we've earned it. These problems of academic competition, bred by limited grants and teaching opportunities, the depression that often ensued by being economically overlooked by those whose opinions you valued, and the anxiety of lying in wait, wondering from where that next fictitious check would arrive, could be circumvented by pooling or socializing our wealth. An idea that emerged from our convivial everyday practices, where talking theory over food turned into studying the practice of sharing food itself. And so we began to pool our wages, stipends and grants, and other forms of income. It began to matter less and less who was nominated for summer grants, who was given a teaching opportunity, who was getting taxed more or less, who was altogether in greater need of financial assistance, who was eligible for one grant as opposed to another, and so on. By pooling our money into a collective account to which we all became responsible, we were able to dodge the various practices the university used to individuate our wages. What we saw as one of the primary practices capitalism uses to instantiate competition as an ideological and conscious narrative. Our practice that then began among a small group of friends became the model for what we proposed to fellow graduate students in our department. There were, of course, difficulties. For one thing, it is not easy to convince your colleagues, even if you are supposedly getting the same pay, to share money with each other for a variety of reasons. First, there was the usual projection of failure, where any attempt to pool our wages, most especially with 6th and 7th years now out of the funding cycle, or people who had partners and children, and others who still occupied all these categories, was seen as naive and impractical, and could only lead to massive poverty. Better, they reasoned, to leave a few in misery and have others relatively well off. Those now out of the funding cycle were too lazy to finish in time anyway. Second, we found that students often clung onto the dream of tenure, thinking that first they would be exceptions to the rule, those talented and hard-working few who could momentarily avoid the problems now facing the increased commodification of the humanities, relegating their experience of graduate school as a mere means to the greener pasture of job security and tenure that awaited them. And lastly, there were people who outright rejected the proposal on ideological grounds, preferring the appearance of individual control over the subsistence, rather than the hazards of dealing with the collective. Simply put, they didn't trust us or one another. Despite these objections that we faced in organizing the student body, there was another hurdle posed by the department and the graduate school. Since they controlled the means of economic distribution and kept that process largely opaque to us, we had little concrete understanding of how the logic of professionalism and economic distribution were linked. So we thought it would be advantageous to articulate a list of demands with the hope of uniting the student body into action. First, we wanted the department to make transparent their yearly budget and external endowments. We did not know, for example, if our department's refusal to fund 6th and 7th year students was an internal policy or an austerity measure imposed on the department by the graduate school that pressured the department by cutting their budget. Second, we demanded that the department make transparent their policies regarding funding. Who receives funding, what projects are prioritized, and according to what criteria. Our sense was that the department tends to fund projects within such fields as new media, and environmental studies at the expense of humanistic and critical studies. Third, we wanted the department to make the teaching field requirement optional. Students at Duke are required to choose and be examined in the literature department, are required to choose and be examined in a teaching field in addition to their research field. The teaching field is an MLA-compatible disciplinary study intended to make you legible to what the faculty imagine to be the current state of the North American academic marketplace. The teaching field, in this sense, is solely at the service of the marketplace, tailoring study to increase the department's job placement rates and improve its national ranking. Any refusal of the teaching field is outright rejected and ridiculed. It is illegible to faculty, as well as to many of our fellow graduate students, to express that as a PhD student, you're not necessarily interested in an academic job, with the exception of being a student. On the one hand, the suggestion that scholarly work does not need to be done in an academic institution is understood at best as an oppositional position, at worst as a naive and juvenile idealism. On the other hand, treating grad work as work, a 5 to 6 year wage labor contract, one that you could seek again, is considered nothing but being a failure or a freeloader. Lastly, we demanded an immediate end to the seizure and mediation of student awards and the relegation of decision-making to graduate and faculty collectives. Duke's literature program has a troubling policy according to which the department absorbs students' external awards and promises us a semester of guaranteed funding beyond the 5th year, that is the end of our funding cycle, for each full year of funding we bring in during the funding cycle. That is to say, once a student is awarded an external grant, the department replaces the grant with their stipend and absorbs the extra money in order to compensate for a budget gap that the graduate school imposed on the department. Simply put, the graduate school systematically underfunds the department, expecting the budget gap to be filled by external grants that the students bring in. So while the graduate school has signed a contract with each individual student for 5 years of guaranteed funding, students are nonetheless expected to generate parts of this money by applying to external grants and receive only half of it should their studies take more than 5 years. In other words, the department is always at deficit, and students are supposed to compensate this deficit by bringing money from external sources, while students themselves are only left with paying application fees and performing necessary labor to receive grants. And so our fellow students rejected these demands, with one exception, the call for financial transparency. The teaching field, they claimed, could be easily navigated on an individual basis, and as such, there was no need for us to demand that it be rendered optional. Moreover, they argued, making the teaching field optional would harm the department's reputation by making it seem less disciplined and professional. Further, our critique of professionalization seemed to them to be an attack on anyone interested in the wage subsistence that came attached to it. That is, lacking what seemed to them as any viable alternative to the academic job market, and with little to no interest in attempting to create an alternative to the form of knowledge production the university had already instantiated, academic wage labor became their utopian end, rather than the very condition of their exploitation. As for the seizure of external funds, this was accepted as a common and unchangeable practice, one even where our department, through negotiating with the graduate school, was generous enough to withhold half the award until the time they deemed it most beneficial for us.
And there was also the idea that extra money is used for recruiting other students, while what was overlooked was the fact that the graduate school is already signing the contract with each individual student.
As we found ourselves left with a rather liberal demand for transparency, As a tactic, the question of financial transparency had a twofold advantage in our situation. First, we were able to isolate specific faculty members by approaching them in private so as to see who was interested in revealing the funding practices of the department and who, on the other hand, believed we had no place or right to delve into such issues, as well as those faculty who were entirely uninterested in how funding operated, instead suggesting that we should just focus on our research. A useful approach, since the faculty could no longer appear as some homogeneous enemy, but was itself full of internal contradictions that we could exploit to our advantage. Second, it worked to galvanize a largely disparate student body that held different and at times antagonistic political positions. No one would stand in opposition to financial transparency without otherwise seeming like they had benefited from it, a position that would ostracize them from their community of coworkers. There were, however, known dangers in homogenizing the student body behind the request for financial transparency that was sundered from what we imagined were our more radical demands. For though we sought transparency in order to better understand our department's economic logic so that we could better distribute our labor and funds, financial transparency also became an end in itself for a large portion of the student body, potentially leaving our desire for full-scale economic change to get easily co-opted by a liberal demand to make things apparent, but nonetheless keep them intact. A logic that ended in a desire for representation on the faculty's executive committee, as opposed to evaluating in what way these tactics could better aid our project of collectivization. Since we were then a minority within the student body, the rhetoric of transparency was soon overtaken by the majority of the student body and used to reinforce the demand for representation, instead of realizing that institutional mediation wasn't required when we could simply redistribute our funds amongst ourselves. And as far as I understand, the representation was not, didn't have any like voting power or anything, right? It was just,
No.
It was just an opportunity to sit
Yeah.
on the committee.
Yeah, what faculty offered was that you can sit in our meetings and look at us.
And you can put it on your CV.
And probably, I think that is exactly the appeal, was a professional appeal, 2012, 2015, faculty representative, graduate student to faculty.
Nonetheless, our inquiry into departmental finances was revealing and eventually came to a head when the graduate student body met with the chair and director of graduate studies. Do you want to do this part?
Sure.
Or is it, there might be some for
Okay.
later.
So we discovered that the director of graduate studies had run a $60,000 fiscal surplus, which they called a reserve money, rather than running a deficit, despite the fact that in previous years a deficit had been run without any serious consequences to the department. And so students in the upper years, during the time that there was this reserve fund, had not received any funding. And the logic that the director of graduate studies had told us was that that money was kept in place for students who might potentially need that money in the future. Another thing was also our insistence to tell them that they should use the money and not hold it for a surplus, because who knows what's going to happen in the future, things can change. And then their response was, it wouldn't be fair to only fund one seventh year and not fund another, so therefore both of them should not receive any funding.
And they didn't also consider the option of giving each person some money.
Right.
That wouldn't be an option.
And then there was the usual insistence on, or the lack of disclosure in regards to how the extra money that was pulled in by external funds was used. There was always this appeal that they made to, well, this is not something we're doing, this is the graduate school that's doing it. So whenever we came upon a point where we wanted to try and isolate who was making the decision and in what way this money was being distributed, they could easily displace their responsibility onto the graduate school. And then there was some general faculty response that we were just privileged graduate students in a private institution, and that we should take out loans, which is what they did during their studies, something that apparently we were unaware of. And when we told them that that's all nice and good, but when you're an international student who doesn't have a credit history, you can't take out loans and you can't work on campus, so they just responded, well, yeah, that's a problem.
They suggested a charity.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, the director of graduate studies suggested that we can have a kind of like a charity kind of thing whereby we can give people money, like $50 or something, for the Xerox.
So the general faculty response, or not general faculty response, the response from the director of graduate studies and the chair was primarily like, whiny grad students, focus on your studies, these problems are not really all that relevant.
Yeah. And there was a pattern whereby those members of the faculty who suggested that we should just stick to our studies were the same members of faculty who were running professionalization boot camps.
Right.
So, the idea of a collective account grew out of everyday practices of cohabitation and as a way of getting by the unfunded summer, even more complicated by our immigrant status that made summer work illegal. Between a summer teaching position, the two of us were planning to co-teach as the class intersected with our research, and random money coming from odd jobs, opening a collective account would just make things easier. Between three people, no regulations are necessary. We'll just deposit all our income in the same account and spend it in fee. As we talked to friends about the account, more people showed interest and the numbers grew from 3 to 6. And problems presented themselves. Considerations about future financial plans emerged, partners were involved who weren't entirely sold on the idea of collectivization, and so on. But it is our insistence, and continues to be, that the socialization of wealth must begin with ourselves and our daily practices. And the problems that emerge with an increase in participants, the mellifluous desires, the necessity for structure and rules, are not things to be determined ahead of time, but to be negotiated in the practices of the moment. And that's where we find ourselves. Yeah, we'll end it there. Thank you.
Which chair is most
The one that I pulled
Maybe
back.
this one?
Move around.
Okay, well, maybe I'll move around a little bit, but, okay, hi again, I'm Sarah, and another thing I didn't mention in my bio is that I'm a recent PhD from the program in literature, and so I'm incredibly proud and inspired by the work that this collective is doing, and just, I don't know, even just like that they would take on the administration and sort of propose this idea of like collectivity is just, I mean, it's about time, is all I can say. And I'm also one of those lazy grad students that took 9 years to finish my PhD. And so, and had to also contend with, the grant structures and all of that, that they're really trying to sort of like rethink approaches to. And so, I mean, this is just the beginning, I think, of a process that I'm just so happy to see what you guys have been doing. And so, especially now that I've moved on. And okay, this paper is a little, it's a little different, but I hope you can see how it relates. It's a little bit more about rich people. It's called Class Consciousness Raising and Pedagogies of Wealth at Resource Generation. Not long after she came into an inheritance of several $1 million worth of property, stocks, and other assets following the passing of her mother and stepfather in close traumatic succession, my good friend Emile broached the subject of helping me out if I needed money. I told her that it could take me a long time to pay her back if I were ever to borrow from her, a statement she countered, well, it wouldn't have to be a loan, to which I replied, I appreciate that, but I wouldn't feel comfortable with not doing my best to pay you back. Sure enough, to weather the transition from a low-paying teaching gig in one city to a life-upending move to another, this summer I asked Emile for $5,000. My plan is to mail her a homemade greeting card every couple months full of jokes, stories she may not have heard on Facebook, and a small check for whatever I feel I can afford to give her. Emile doesn't expect this of me, and in all honesty, I may never reach that $5,000 mark, but it's what I need to do to keep the peace with cultural demons that tell me, as David Graeber has sardonically put it, a person must pay one's debts. And so kind of like Robert was saying, I've really internalized sort of the discourse of personal failure around debt. Years before she claimed her fortune under the tragic circumstances ushering in its immediate and expansive presence, Emile and I would have intense, not always easy conversations about the shaping forces of wealth and poverty in our lives. The gifts, in the form of cash, clothes, and other goods that her parents would continually send her. The privately subsidized aspects of her ability to live off an AmeriCorps stipend. The hopelessness I felt as a first-generation college student 5 years into a PhD program, knowing that my continued studies would only propel my nearly $70,000 in student loan debt even further into the stratosphere, and by the time I graduated, it was well over $100,000. Worried about my 3 younger sisters, all of whom hold substantial college debt while struggling to find meaningful living wage work in Portland, Oregon, official home of the well-educated barista. Still processing the loss of a mother to cancer whose understanding of her daughter's queer identity remained elusive, Emile's growing closeness with my family, which she loves for our, quote, open, comfortable way of being together, also led to a series of gifts. With the proceeds of the sale of Emile's stepfather's Jeep Liberty, my mom paid off a couple of lingering parent-financed education loans. In a less tangible form of social capital exposure, Em also gave my family a key to her beach house. Coming and going as they please, my mom and sisters can now gaze at the crashing Oregon surf from a hillside cabin, a true luxury considering that a day trip to the beach has rarely been within our means. Emile's articulated interest in sharing her wealth with me and my family coincided with her involvement in Resource Generation, a national organization composed of self-identified, quote, young people with wealth, aged 35 and below, most of whom are committed to investing their resources in social justice causes and configurations. Born out of an original Boston chapter in the late 90s, Resource Generation, or RG as members refer to it, now claims growing chapters in most major U.S. cities, a national conference, and a vital online presence composed of regularly updated blogs, videos, organizing tools, and downloadable training manuals. Materials that owe much of their strategic and philosophical force to anti-oppression education efforts spearheaded by groups like Class Action and the People's Institute for Survival and Beyond, as well as texts like Eduardo Bonilla Silva's Racism Without Racists and Betsy Leondar Wright's Class Matters, Cross-Class Alliance Building for Middle-Class Activists. For the remainder of this discussion, I'll focus primarily on one of the several RG staff-authored and illustrated guidebooks available for free download, 2006's Classified, How to Stop Hiding Your Privilege and Use It for Social Change. In addition to its clear articulation of what I would take to be the twin goals of the RG mission, class consciousness raising for people with wealth, as well as a revisioning of what Western and particularly U.S.-based philanthropy could be, reading Classified was a revelation in that I found myself thinking, wow, I am learning a hell of a lot about how the class system operates from listening to these rich kids confess and analyze the nuances of their class experiences. In 2008, Jeff Williams summarized the main points of his earlier article, The Pedagogy of Debt, discussing what the existence of the indebted or indentured student signifies and what and how debt teaches. Debt, he said, rewrites the social contract from a public entitlement to education to a privatized service and teaches less than humanistic lessons about education as a consumer good, about higher education as job training rather than intellectual exploration, and about civil society as a commercial market rather than a polis. And I think that both the collective and Robert were getting at some of those issues as well. As familiar and bleakly assimilated as these lessons appear to us in higher education today, I would argue that what it takes for debt to begin to signify something else, something not grounded in meritocratic mythology, austerity politics, and the market-driven logic of privatized wealth distribution, is for the kind of conversations happening among the rich kids at Resource Generation to be elevated to what I call a public pedagogy of wealth. Looking closely at just a few of the most significant things that I, a member of the indentured class and scholar of working class studies as well, learned from reading Classified, I hope to make a case for my belief that class revolution, or even the elusive reanimation of a politically empowered left that many of us are gunning for, will not be possible unless class-conscious people of wealth vociferously own the task of speaking public truth to the power of hidden elements of their class privilege. One thing Classified teaches is that, particularly at the psychic level of how extreme abundance or lack of wealth are internalized, people who go through much of their lives enjoying exorbitant resources to which they do not necessarily feel themselves entitled have much in common with those who have experienced poverty. Indeed, the very metaphor through which the guidebook is structured as an exercise in class consciousness raising, the idea of opening the classified file, exposing RG members' secret, unspoken histories of wealth privilege, reveals cross-class passing behavior, avoidance of direct conversations about the nature and status of family resources, and other behaviors that signify the kind of shame-addled relationship to wealth that many people from poverty backgrounds find similar. Moreover, this self-styled hiding is strongly correlated with access to college, the mythical melting pot in which one's personal history of wealth or poverty finds room to chameleonize itself amidst the obstreperous ideological trumpeting of education's egalitarian potential. A humorously wrought top 10 list of the top 10 ways to hide your wealth privilege contains gems like ordering the cheapest thing on the menu to de-emphasize your wealth when out at a restaurant, or having friends drop you off a few blocks from your home to avoid having them experience ostentation. Both strategies similarly adopted by those attempting to hide the empty wallets and rundown apartments that threaten to reveal their poverty. However, as Classified emphasizes, this avoidance behavior has radically different economic and political consequences for those from the working and owning classes. Working class and increasingly middle class people must reckon with the material impact of poverty regardless of attempts to effectively pass as a class beyond their means. One need only be reminded of the subprime mortgage crisis to understand the seduction and consequences of the desire to claim the American dream without the material basis to sustain its illusions. But for people with wealth, hiding or refusing to discuss wealth privilege not only generally comes without any of these material consequences, but actively ensures a continued accumulation of wealth as a cronyistic, keep-it-in-the-family venture, ideologically re-entrenching what may be the ultimate privilege of wealth. That the more you have of it, the more right you have to keep information concerning its accumulated status a private matter. Most RG members, Classified's contributors insist, were raised to believe that it would be dangerous to discuss their family's wealth, both within and without the privacy of home. The danger of public wealth exposure is the assumption of revolt, where the non-wealthy majority granted proper access to the file cabinet of owning class reality. Or when it comes to social justice-minded young people demanding frank talk about their own wealth, class revolt from within their ranks. Pedagogically, these files could teach that working class outrage over what Carolyn Steedman has called the impossible unfairness of things is more than justified, and that people with wealth committed to social justice have a responsibility, as one RG blogger put it, to use their wealth privilege to facilitate the transfer of resources from their private coffers to a public or common purse. In addition to some of the less surprising yet still crucial lessons coming from the declassification of private wealth histories, laying bare the hyperbole or patent falsehood of stories about self-made relatives, for instance, or the exposure of ongoing family investment in exploitative multinational corporations, Classified also stresses how feeling muzzled by mores of cultural propriety dictating silence around wealth issues grants an opacity to young people of wealth's ability to understand the nature and extent of the resources available to them. Wealthy activists often don't even know how to begin using their wealth for social change purposes, in other words, because they don't really know what they have or what such resources could mean. How can you figure out how much money you have to give, the guidebook asks, if you can't talk to an advisor or your partner or your family about your resources? Moreover, Classified recounts an especially problematic form of hidden class experience that may be particular to wealthy young people, but has broader implications for how politically loaded concepts like entitlement and dependency get discussed. Quote, the totally conflicting and confusing messages that some of us get, stressing both, you deserve this money, and you'd never be able to make it on your own. This peculiar consciousness, I argue, underlies why it remains difficult for most young people of wealth, social justice proclivities or no, to adopt a critical stance toward the meritocratic underpinnings of their deserving status. Though wealth, as Classified stresses, is undeniably about, quote, the freedom to make plans for our dreams and to take risks because we have resources to fall back on if we fail, the pedagogical core of this more conflicted message also suggests the degree to which a fear of being labeled dependent underwrites the complacency and silence characteristic of the U.S. class system, ensuring that potential risk-takers among the wealthy not step too far afield of their place within the hierarchy of wealth, status, and power. Considering that a disproportionate number of RG members relative to the greater population of wealthy young people are women, people of color, and queer identified, the intersection of wealth privilege with a lack of other forms of social privilege additionally frames RG's conversations, giving rise to a host of issues that warrant more discussion than I have space for here. But perhaps the most important outcome of Resource Generation's pedagogy of public wealth exposure is the radicalization of members' attitudes and strategies toward redistribution of their wealth. The heart of this intervention is the basic premise that responsible philanthropy requires not only moving money, quote, from communities that have more than they need into communities that have less than they need, but that those on the receiving end of giving maintain control over how resources are distributed and used. In Philanthropy Won't Save Philly Schools, Rich People Should Pay More Taxes, a recent entry from RG's main blog site, members of the Philadelphia RG chapter critique wealthy philanthropists' investment in charter schools as both, quote, eroding the development of a healthy public system and weakening the democratic process. When we give away money while maintaining the power to decide what gets funded, we perpetuate the injustice we think we're addressing, they insist. Emphasizing how family wealth enabled them to opt out of underfunded public school systems and districts, RG members advocate their own mandatory reinvestment in the strengthening of these institutions. Require us to opt into the public sphere, they demand, not choose to pay to set our lives apart. Moreover, opting into the public sphere in a truly democratized manner requires that those with wealth aggressively interrogate deeply internalized assumptions framing what it means to be a giver. First and foremost, that the possession of wealth implies the right to paternalistically police the return on one's philanthropic efforts. Living in Rye House, a Minneapolis area intentional community composed of college graduates with, quote, high-paying degrees that include sociology, food justice, and American studies, RG bloggers Emily and Joe discuss how their owning class status enables them to contribute more to the house's common purse than other members. A purse that, in addition to allowing the house to pay off $1,000 in collective student loan debt each month, as well as everyone's basic living expenses, provides each member with a small individual allowance and further discretionary cash according to housemates' unique needs. So this gets at some of kind of what the collective was talking about like the everyday way to make this happen. A propensity towards systemic critiques of capitalism notwithstanding, perhaps the most significant return that Emily and Joe have accumulated as members of Rye House is how the common purse has forced them to internally confront a condition that Joe refers to as, quote, the capitalism within our hearts. Acknowledging the sting of greed he often feels when someone takes from the pot a little bit more than I do, Joe challenges himself to, quote, trust that others truly need what they say and let go of what I've been trained to see as my hard-earned money. Certain aspects of this arrangement strike me as elitist despite the best intentions of those involved. Indeed, Rye House is a community composed entirely of liberal arts college graduates, members of a self-selected educated class, regardless of relative degrees of wealth and other forms of social privilege. That said, I remain intrigued by the notion of what class-conscious members of the owning class can teach by claiming and reframing capitalism as a curable form of heart disease rather than an inevitability. The linchpin of which may be the complacent silence with which the wealthy so often accept and further entrench the private benefits of this system. Running for president in 2012, Mitt Romney insisted that the redistribution of wealth should only be discussed in quiet rooms, away from the envious masses and their cries for public accountability. Organizations like Resource Generation countered the Romneys of the world by demonstrating that there are wealthy people prepared to use their resources to strengthen rather than further dismantle the social contract, even if this involves diminishing or sacrificing forms of privilege to which their owning class status entitles them. Thank you.
Okay, so we have about a half an hour for questions, and I would invite all the panelists to come up and here front and expand his presence as such. Wow.
There's enough.
I guess I'll just stand.
Yes. A question for Duke Collective about when discussing the types of things that Duke and this like project and like the lived experience of this kind of pooling and collectivity, like maybe expand a little bit on the type of reactions that get, or like points and things of like interest, reluctance, or how people, in a context, just like deal with this, or if there's certain like assumptions that people make. I'm just interested in like what, if possible, is like starting this kind of conversation going, continuing.
The people involved, or
people not involved.
The people not involved.
Yeah.
Assumptions about the collective, the people who are not involved.
Like the skepticism?
Partly, yeah. These are skepticism or like immediate responses, or just like what kind of like more like emotions or assumptions that seem to be fueling some of that.
I mean, some immediate responses is like you always assume that you're the wealthy one, so that the person you're going to be sharing with is actually like going to be trading from your wealth, which is an odd thing because then everyone becomes wealthy in the room. But it's I don't know. Yeah, I mean, it happens to be. I want to call it solidarity or like trust issue, but it's just it's hard to come to a point where like my experience has always been. So there have been some objections end up being displaced in the sense that they become like political or ideological, that are just masking the fact that they don't want to share, that they don't trust the person they're sharing with. And so you start projecting failure and you talk about this is impossible, what about this, what about that, and you bring up all these things, why it can't work in order just to mask the fact that you don't trust the person that you're going to share the mic with. But building that trust and that solidarity, I don't know. I mean, that's just I don't know how to. It's just it emerged out of our daily practice. Like we were roommates and we were just essentially we had individual accounts, but we were like sharing everything. Like you just share the food, just share everything. And so we just thought, why not just open a collective account and make things easier? Like it almost emerges out of like a common practice of like the family model. It's like this happens all the time. This is not something that's really irregular. The idea is to move past the confines of the family as just simply a blood or filial relationship and understand that solidarity can happen even beyond those measures.
I mean, one of the responses from the outside from the beginning when we were like basically living with sharing everything, the response from the outside mostly was that Naveed and Kareem are a couple and they don't want to live. So there was like, the thing that comes out of it is that the only way you can understand sharing and cohabitation and conviviality is through the kind of like institution of family. There's no other way to understand nuclear family. There's no other way to like accept this or to kind of like understand this whole.
And the problem of well, what are you gonna do if somebody wants to buy a car, or buy a house, or have a family, and those are questions, But I think the response has mostly been like, we'll figure it out as we get there. and
Mm.
also it also then makes it makes you challenge your own assumptions about like, well, why would I want to buy a house, or why would I want to have a nuclear family? Like, in what ways does the spirit of the collective start to also change our assumptions about our life generally, and about the future, and about wealth generally?
And it's a fairly new project we've undertaken, so we still haven't had to confront problems like people moving away, like people who graduate, and like if someone got a tenure track job, what would that do? And they move to a different geographic. Like it seems like this works to some degree because of geographical proximity and similar costs of living and to some degree similar pace. But we haven't yet confronted those problems in practice because they haven't emerged, so we don't see any reason to.
I mean, a lot of like internal problems have emerged, which have basically been resolved by kind of treating them lightheartedly and through kind of jokingly, through jokes. For example, like we had, like, I don't know, like who was like someone had gone and checked like who has to spend how much money on the collective. And it basically turned out that like you don't need to do that. So everyone was basically giving each other shit. So to solve the problem, to kind of like come to an understanding of like we don't need to do that.
When did you first undertake the experiment? Just how long has it been
A
already?
year and something now?
Yeah, about a year.
Yes.
Just a follow-up question. Did you find that your spending patterns changed at all?
I mean,
No.
no.
Like
I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know how to keep track, but I haven't noticed a change in my habits. I mean, at first when we did it, it was strange because part of the problem was actually encouraging people to use the money.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Because there was like this general reaction that it's like,
Yeah.
this is not mine, how can I use this? Yeah, exactly. There was a lot of guilt. Sorry? But yeah.
Maybe at the back? Yes, you.
This is for Robert. Thank you for Strike Dead and Reader Supporting News. I'm Darth Vader's mom. Hi, Occupy in the beginning. Appreciate everything you've done. Some of the things you were talking about today, not surprised. I'm not shocked at what you say. I like the fact that everything's, so cogent the way that you articulate it. But as a teacher, I know that so few students know what you talked about, and that's, one of my purposes today. I'm going to be talking about how we teach students, and occupy the classroom. There's something that, from this whole discussion that kind of strikes me as, you probably have all read Unpacking the Male Backpack, Unpacking the White Knapsack. This is just the beginning of unpacking the academic knapsack, the tenured academic knapsack, and that's what needs to happen in the classroom, as you were saying, from the very first semester onward. And the only way that the students, who are the ones, the undergraduates,
thanks. Yeah, I think, I started teaching freshman comp this semester. It's that sort of thing is to try to implement outside research about what it means to be a student in the 21st century. The joint superstructural theme for the writing course is consumer culture. So I thought, what better place to start than right here. And I think, also too, I'm with undergraduates, especially at UT. I know this isn't true at all locations, but it doesn't seem to be an immediate activist culture that anyone can see on campus. And I think that's really isolating those who not only they want to be involved, but those who want to go out and do some of that investigation you were talking about into their own debt situation as undergraduates is rebuilding the ethics cultures on campus so that there's an ability to plug in students and to get them involved in that work without making them feel like they have to go out and do it all on their own, which can be very daunting. So.
There's one on the side here.
I just had a question for the Duke Collective. I was just curious whether anyone part of the collective wasn't part of your friendship circle, because I can imagine sort of building trust outside of friendship circles would perhaps make it more difficult.
There was one person who was like less involved in the friendship circle. But we have
We're trying to tell you something.
But no, it hasn't.
I mean, yeah, we don't all have the same circle of friends. That's like there are some people in the collective that just we actually don't see often.
Are all four of you involved in pooling your resources in the collective?
No, this Gab is.
Well,
She uses the resources.
No, but
doesn't
it's
she?
not money. I'm an undergrad
Yeah.
of job.
Okay, how many people are there?
Now seven.
That actually just
Yeah.
pool literally collectively into one account your
Yeah.
resources.
And the way it works is like so Wells Fargo, at least in the Durham area, Wells Fargo is the only bank that would allow us to do that. And
And they're starting to get weird.
yeah, they're starting to get a little strange, but it's quite mundane. It's like everyone has a card and no one really keeps track. It's just.
So not even credit unions would do that? Sorry, I don't mean to.
Actually, because I'm a state employee, I have an account at the credit union in North Carolina, which I'm gonna see if they will allow people that are at the same address. So I don't know. I need to ask them if there's any way that we can finagle that. They actually tend to be pretty cooperative, on our side at the credit union. So.
And when it first started, we looked into what would be the benefits of seeing if we can when you make yourself into a business to get tax breaks. Yeah, incorporate. But to get tax breaks and find certain ways of taking advantage of this. And so I also started calling certain service providers like Time Warner and seeing is there a collective package for a small business kind of thing. But they had problems and they said we all have to be in the same building. But the potential with the bank side as well is if you guys get large enough to about 15, then you could incorporate and then see the benefits you could get from that.
It is made paying in restaurants and bars very easy.
Yeah, I mean it's made.
No one finds it anymore. Someone just puts the card in.
Especially if you're all in a friendship group and you're there.
But I think that seems to be one of the problems with presenting it, proposing it to other graduate students who aren't really friends with us. I think that's where, talking about the distinction between friend and colleague became very clear there. And we talk a lot about what does it mean to have friendship be the base of our work generally, and what happens when that's kind of impossible. And the only way we can relate to each other is through these professional relations and discourses. people didn't want to be a part of it, in part because there wasn't a sense of friendship.
Colleen?
Yeah, it's so radically amazing what you're doing, and I'm just wondering if you would consider like writing a handbook or a small text that could then, I don't want to like overburden you with more work, but something that's accessible online, or if you've already done it, excuse me, I haven't seen it, that other graduate students at other universities could emulate, because I think it's more and more something that graduate students would actually be interested in, even if you're not necessarily, especially from smaller cohorts, like I'm from a smaller department. It'd be interesting to reach out across language and lit departments and see what the feedback would be. So to share your experience and have that kind of generosity, that kind of friendship that you're talking about in this collective, be something that's broadened nationally and possibly.
I think actually, like, the one problem with something like a handbook would be like to have rules and stuff. And like the only thing is that like I think like this would be a way of talking about it. I think like one thing that has definitely like come out of it has been like for me like in my classes I found myself constantly talking about friendship in the classes that I'm teaching, or like I think Adra had the same thing, or like the classes that we co-taught and like those kind of like that probably has been the way, but I don't know if it would be possible to talk about. Basically, put your money together and spend it too well.
Be friends, care for each other.
It sounds like you guys have done a lot of groundwork that would then have to just be redone by the next organization, the next graduate student.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I think that'd be a productive thing to do.
The question about teaching brought up too, I think, like in terms of how the collective supports one another, or how we as friends help one another. At Chapel Hill, I had to teach composition. I have to teach every semester. And these guys at the private school teach every semester. So when I teach, there's been ways that like in teaching composition courses, I've tried to kind of take the pressure off, make it a more productive space and not one where I or the students feel exploited. But we've also talked about the next time I teach it, having my friends come in and teach classes as well when they're not teaching. Like it just like spreads out the work so that we don't have to complain about being composition and have to do all this work on my own. Like there's always a group of people to help one another out.
Nora?
Yeah, maybe so I want to ask a question to Sarah and Robert together, but just to maybe follow up on, I think what part of Elsa's point is there seems to be a massive difference between an organizing model and like union politics or student activism and what you guys are doing, because you keep talking about friendship and trust, which is a very different kind of language, and I don't know if that's been like an intentional choice or decision that you made, but is like rather than going out to find other people that you actually don't know, like who would do an organizing campaign, to say like, hey, here's this project we have going on, do you want to be a part of this? Like, it's a lot slower, and it's a different kind of idea about what the relationship status has to be with people. So maybe you can talk about if that has not been an intentional choice, like maybe it's just come up. That's just the organic model of the project, but that's just an interesting distinction that I thought of. But also for Sarah and Robert, I was thinking. I mean, I think it's been great yesterday and today that like a lot of the conversations around research that we can do are not just like, hey, this is information that you can produce, but like this also has to be collectivized and socialized, and all of these, that the research that you do feeds into the way that you organize your life collectively and individually, and obviously the Duke Collective is a example of this, and also the group that you're talking about is an example of this. But I was wondering if you guys can say anything about the difficulties around collectivizing student debt, because obviously it's one thing that Roland Jubilee is trying to do, but some of the legal obstacles and other obstacles around thinking about collectivizing debt rather than collectivizing resources, and if you guys have any thoughts about that, the obstacles that stand in the way of doing that both ideologically and legally and whatnot. So that was just a question.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not sure that I can speak to that totally. I mean, it was interesting that this Rye House, this collective, one of their things that they do is that they have like sort of a standard paying off a collective amount of student debt, that among their kind of affinity group, I guess, or model of which I think is really similar actually to what the Duke Collective is in terms of the way that things function and the forms of trust that are built. But they've institutionalized like taking a part of that fund to pay off student loan debt every month. And so that's one way I think that they've come up with, using that pool of collective funds, that seems to be working for them. But it's it's probably about the same size of a group, it sounds like, as the Duke Collective. And so one of the questions that I would have for them is like, what if there's someone like me who owes so much, and again, it has to do with each in their own ability to pay what they can, and then sort of like giving over again sort of the ways that it's been internalized to paternalistically police our right to our hard-earned money. But part of the whole goal of resource generation is to sort of like demystify the fact that this is family money. This isn't hard-earned money. This is generational money. This is money that sometimes goes back to slavery and exploitation, and I mean they have a lot of really hard conversations about those kinds of issues and where that money came from, to demystify the idea that it's that there is meritocracy at the basis of this, and so that kind of intersects with these issues of like having to deal with how you feel when you put more into the collective pool and it seems like someone is taking more, but making that, putting that issue of student, sort of structurally incorporating the issue of like paying off a certain amount of student debt with the collective fund is, that's something that they're doing at least.
Yeah, I think that's a great idea. Collective pooling. The way student debt has been reformed since 2010, it is legalistically very individuated. I think it's something you can't get rid of, even in bankruptcy. If you die, your heirs get your debt. It's a very isolating debt structure to be a part of. And I think the idea of collective pooling for student debt within, say, a cohort or in an apartment would be a really interesting model. It's something I don't know if it exists for student debt specifically, but I think that would be a really interesting model. And I mean, in terms of Strike Debt and Occupy Student Debt Campaign, our sort of utopian goal was to have a mass politically charged default on student debt for those who had already who are out of school and who no longer pay. The big critique of it was, well, that's a huge risk, not just for individual debtors. It means all sorts of punitive action against them for defaulting on their debt. But what does it say about our culture if you can't repay our debts? And it goes back to this personal responsibility mantra. And what's unfortunate is that there is a default for student debt. It's just not being politicized, or but it's not being articulated or collectively used as a type of activist tool. People just go into default on their own and are left alone to sort of suffer there. And so part of what we've been trying to do, maybe unsuccessfully, is to collectivize those who are approaching default, who may very well end up in default, and to use that as an articulation of resistance to the student debt system. But I think the collective pooling in terms for those who are currently in graduate school is a very useful idea.
Yes.
Thanks. This was really great and really interesting. So I guess I have a question, hopefully, for all of the panelists, because what all, I guess, like the collective and then the two panelists talked about are these small actions that sort of produce cracks in the edifice of capitalism or in a culture of student debt. but you're dealing with enormous structures. So like capitalism is obviously huge. The whole, the ways that universities fund themselves using student debt is an enormous structure to take on. And so I guess I'm wondering how you, I don't know that I want to use the word telos, not so much what's the telos of all of this, but how do you see yourselves in terms of taking on these large structures? Is what you see yourself doing is making these cracks, or is there a sense that at some point there needs to be a kind of reconfiguration in which something else has to happen so that these structures can be can crumble as opposed to just be weakened by these pockets of resistance?
Yeah, well, one of the reasons that I even wanted to sort of do this project on resource generation in the first place is just that I think that it's really important that people with wealth be as much of a part of the conversation about what their where their money is coming from, where their money has come from, what their, why is it that they don't have debt? Why we want to see the numbers there as well. I think that one of the things I've run into is just, again, the opacity of the ability to even produce that kind of information. Like, I actually wound up giving a survey to a number of my friends that was like, okay, so tell me, how much money did your parents spend on your preschool? How much did they spend on your private high school? How much did you get for, when you were taking test prep for college? Literally going back and charting, what are the forms of wealth privilege that have gone into who you are, and that get to look like merit, that get to look like talent, that get to look like ability, and have you gotten to take advantage of unpaid internships, those kinds of things. Is that these kinds of things need to be every bit as much a part of our open dialogue as the math coming out and the listing of numbers, of how much we all owe in terms of our student debt, and so this is sort of one of my things that I really think needs to be happening. I'm not necessarily, and so one thing that I was thinking was at Duke, for instance, the freshmen coming in, they have to read books. They assign books to freshmen before they even get there. What if they were to assign a text like Classified, to these Duke freshmen, as the book that they have to read, or that there would be a workshop like this that would be run for them before they even get to the first day of class. And so some of those kinds of, so just in thinking in a larger way about how to implement some of the kind of work that a group like Resource Generation is committed to doing in this larger way would be assign this text. Again, as someone, I feel like I learned so much, as someone from a working class background, about just the kinds of assumptions that wealthy young people make about the things they can and cannot or shouldn't talk about. And again, so much of it goes back to the family and these assumptions of I don't want to damage the reputation of my family. I don't want to be ostracized by my family by talking about our wealth history, by really being transparent about what privilege has done for me in my life, so we can have a conversation about what those who have not had that privilege, so that we can really get to a point of understanding what wealth and the wealth inequality is a structural issue. It's not about individual failure. It's not about merit or not. And so we have to get to that point. And so,
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Sorry. Yeah, I think Sarah's absolutely right. As someone with a little bit of knowledge into the upper middle class world, money is something, like we were talking about Mitt Romney, is something you talk about in private. And the access and privilege to university is not only expected, but will sort of be done as silently and without much financial debate. And I really like this idea of generating conversation through a type of line item, or almost like a receipt of, as maybe in a panel or a pre-orientation seminar for students. But I think you'd also have to be careful about, and this is where in my class, I'm trying to be careful about patronizing or insulting students who actually are on a financial precipice in terms of their financial situation. They may be first-time college attendees. They may come from a background where they really are totally in debt to attend university. But I think I like this idea of making a line item sort of receipt or tally to show how much it costs to make it look like there's merit and make it look like there's talent. I really like that idea.
Okay, so we have maybe time for one more question, then we'll have to wrap up. We'll go a little bit over. So in the middle here? Oh, you're going to respond? Sorry about that.
Yeah, I wanted to
sure.
so basically in response to both questions, I think this would be probably a point of clash as well between us. But I think any form of thinking about kind of like having an impact on a big system still resonates with some kind of imperial politics and imperial language of like world change or something. So I would rather think about things in very local terms. But on the other, and the friendship question comes in here for me, I guess, that in the sense that systems do not establish power relations, but kind of envelop them from outside and kind of try to fix them, then it is always possible to kind of pour out of this diagrams. And friendship is kind of basically simply could be in strategy of pouring out, of kind of dodging the diagram, of kind of like not acting within its fixture, trying to do something else. And it's always possible to do it because we basically do it on a very everyday basis.
And friendship is not exclusive. The spirit of friendship, I think, that we're talking about doesn't have the exclusivity that nuclear family does, or the couple does.
Does it have limitations then? Or are there limits to it?
Yeah, probably limits are, I mean, it's like I guess the limits would be defined probably, because if we look at it from kind of an ontology of individualism, in a way, we establish friendships, but from a relational perspective, probably friendship is a result of a constant brokering of difference. So the limits are basically what we broker constantly.
Okay, well, we're actually at the end of the time for this panel, so apologies if you had a question and we couldn't fit it in, but there's plenty of time during the breaks and over lunch to talk about all of this, and panelists will be here. So let's again thank all the panelists for being here.
So I think we've got 15 minutes.
Yeah, the break is about 15 minutes. We'll reconvene around 11:15.